Welcome back to the Cutler Report. All right, in his latest Armageddon gloom and doom book, my friend and former Reagan administration budget boss Dave Stockman has a very pessimistic view about the future of the country. I hope he's wrong. Again, here now is the aforementioned David Stockman, former Republican congressman from Michigan, President Ronald Reagan's budget director, and the author most recently of The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America, which is climbing the bestseller list. Nice going. Look, I didn't read the whole book. I read a big chunk of the book, though. There's so much in there that I agree with. Overspending and regulating and crony capitalism and bad money and all the rest of it. But back in '86, when you wrote your first book, The Triumph of Politics, you were just as gloomy and just as doomy as you are today. And we had a 2-decade run, and you're still blasting Ronald Reagan, who I would argue was the launcher of that 2-decade run of prosperity, Dave. Why do you keep blaming Reagan, who gave you your start in big-time politics?
I'm not saying I blame him. I'm saying that a lot of what you're saying, Larry, unfortunately, is an urban legend. We did not have anything unusual. We had a devastating recession in the early 80s because of the Great inflation. Volcker crushed inflation. Reagan backed him. I give him credit for that. We had a nice rebound after that, which you always have when you're that deep. Take the 12 years of Bush and Reagan together. You had 3% GDP growth average. But after that, we've had bubble after bubble of what I call Keynesian inflation. First, we had the fiscal bubble from Reagan and Bush. That was
what fiscal bubble? You know,
Larry, it was a huge fiscal bubble.
Okay. I went back and looked at it. Look, you were my boss, but I was the numbers guy in OMB, and I went back and checked some things. Okay, yes, Reagan increased the debt by $1.5 trillion, okay? A pittance compared to the economic growth.
But not exactly.
And I went back and looked. Bill Clinton also raised the debt by about the same amount. The two of them, and I'm putting the 80s and 90s together because I always thought Clinton was Reagan's third term. Okay, so you know what you got here? If you take a look at all this stuff, $3 trillion of debt were created in the 80s and 90s. $3 trillion of publicly held federal debt. Do you know what households' net wealth did? That's assets, liabilities. They increased by $35 trillion, a factor of just about 12. $3 trillion in federal debt and $35 trillion in private household debt. David Stockman, you're not doing your math right.
Yes, I am.
Assets were soaring because the economy was innovative
but you're
growing.
missing the other side of the balance sheet. Debt was soaring even more. When we
I just got through telling you, debt went up $3 trillion, and household net worth went up $35 trillion.
You want to talk about this or not? Okay,
but David, those are the numbers.
No, those aren't the numbers. I'm talking about total debt in the public and private economy. It was $5 trillion when we were sitting there. It's $56 trillion today. It's up tenfold. The GDP, which you told me about when you were my economist, was $3.5 trillion. It's up about fourfold. We had a massive leveraged buyout during that period because of easy money at the Fed and big deficits.
But not the 80s and 90s. Wait, you're talking about the 2000s.
No, I'm not talking, Larry.
The 80s and 90s, the inflation rate collapsed.
I am not talking about the 2000s. I'm talking about Greenspan's first 13 years. He expanded the balance sheet of the Fed by 8% a year for 13 years, even worse than Arthur Burns. It created a massive bubble which collapsed, as you know, in 2002-01. They reflated it again. It collapsed again. You know, we've had no economic growth
created
to speak
about
of.
50 million, close to 50 million new jobs with a roaring stock market, and I don't think you give that much credit. And by the way, Greenspan kept the inflation rate down very low, following in the footsteps of Volcker. But I just want to make a comment. Look, having known you as long as I have, and I admire you, and you're a friend, okay, and I love working for you. Tough, but I love working with you. I just want to say this. You tell me, I don't believe that you ever really understood the economic incentive model of growth. I think you're obsessed with this debt argument, and I think you're partially true, particularly in the last 10 or dozen years. But regarding the 80s and 90s in particular, look, Dave, if it pays more to work and invest and take risks and innovate, people will. I don't think you ever either understood that or ever believed that. You know, I heard Eric Schmidt.
That is wrong. That is wrong.
I heard Eric Schmidt of Google last night. All right, he was on Sean Hannity's TV show, and Sean asked him what to do about debt and deficits. And you know what he said? Grow and innovate. And that's what I want to say to you, as I have down in the past. the tax rate reductions, the deregulation, the disinflation, remade the American economy so it became a growth machine, and that's what held down deficits, and that's what held down debt until the 2000s.
Well, that is not right, because since 2000 it hasn't been growing. We had the huge Well, wait a minute. We had the huge Bush tax cuts. That didn't do any good. We've had huge bubbles on Wall Street that have only basically helped speculators, not the Main Street economy. We've created really no new middle-class jobs since 2000. You can look it up. That's a number.
We're arguing past each other because I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not making a case for the 2000s. How did all of this miracle
suddenly
end
when the same policies
I'm saying that you've lumped
Larry.
the 80s and 90s into the last 10 or 12 years.
You're mythologizing
and you shouldn't.
the 80s
no,
and 90s.
I'm not.
You
what I'm saying is
are.
You don't understand that lower tax rates and deregulation unleashed an economic boom.
Can I tell you something?
Created the innovation that made America the envy of the world in its free market economy.
How did you get into the Reagan administration as the economist at OMB? I came to Wall Street in 1981 preaching the gospel of lower rates, fiscal rectitude, and getting inflation down.
But you gave up on it, David.
I didn't give up on it. I did not give up on it.
You gave the interview to Bill Greider, and it sounded like you were turning the back on it, Dave. Why did you do that?
That's not even true. I could look at reality and see that we cut taxes way too much. We didn't cut spending at all. Defense got out of control. We had massive deficits, and part of the plan all along was fiscal rectitude, and you couldn't grow your way out of something.
You were growing your way out of it.
You were not growing your way.
You were growing your way out of it. That's the only way you're ever going to get the deficit down is by substantial economic growth.
Hey, just like the debates we had back then, you had $2 trillion worth of deficits during the Bush-Reagan 12 years. The economy grew at 3%, and at the end, the deficit was still 4% of GDP.
The deficit was less than 2% of GDP.
It was 4% of GDP.
And that boom continued into the 90s,
That is not even right. The numbers aren't even close.
And I think you should rethink. Look, I think you've got a point about the 2000s, and I think you've got a second point about bad monetary policy. I think those are good points. And I think you've got a third point about crony capitalism. All good points. But I think you're mistaking the benefits of lower tax rates and deregulation in the 80s and 90s. Dave Stockman is the author of The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America. We got a little set too. That's all right. We can both take it.